Hello, everyone. My name is Ye Qin. I'm from Vermilion Art Gallery. So Vermilion is focused on contemporary Chinese art, and we start operating since 2015. It's a lockdown time, so gallery is closed. We try to do something to connect with each other and to entertain everyone. Very luckily today, we have Dr. Geoff Raby join us from Beijing. Hi, Geoff.
Hi, Cheng. Hello, everyone.
Geoff, everyone may know very well, is a former ambassador from Australia to China, and he's also a contemporary art collector and supporter. He has been working as an independent consultant for last, how many years? 12, 13 years.
10.
Yeah, and recently many of you may saw his new book just been published by Melbourne University Publishing. So congratulations to the big success of book, Geoff.
Thank you.
Yeah, so today we have Geoff talk about a very special trip recently he did in Dunhuang. Before that, I'll let everyone know. We'll have Geoff to talk to us about his Dunhuang trip. And then we have a time for Q&A, so people can type your question in, and then Geoff can respond to them. That's the second half of the talk. And the whole Zoom talk we're aiming to finish before 7 o'clock Australian time, a bit senior time here. So to start, Geoff, we Melbourne, Sydney, South Australia, we're all in lockdown at the moment. Can you please share a little bit of life in China, life in Beijing, especially what's like now?
Well, thanks, Ye Ching, and thanks very much for organising this in the Vermilion Gallery. And you didn't mention, but I've also curated 2 shows at the Vermilion Gallery on Chinese contemporary art, including the first all-female group show in 2018, which was a huge honour and privilege for me to be able to do. And thank you for making that possible, Ye Ching. Yes, well, look, I feel guilty because I escaped Sydney on the 5th of May, having had months and months of freedom in Australia to come back to China. And I needed to come back because basically my house is here, my life is here. I left China on the 4th of January 2020 to spend 3 weeks in India. Some of that was spent with Ye Ching and her husband Stephen at the Jaipur Literary Festival. But then by the time we're getting to the end of the festival, as January rolled on, there are more and more reports about pandemic in China, thinking it was just like SARS 2003, which I went through. In fact, I was starting the FTA with China, Free Trade Agreement discussions with China back in 2003. And I traveled in and out of China a lot via Hong Kong. The Hong Kong airport was empty for most of the time, but I never thought that this pandemic would lead to the suspension of international travel. And I'm sure just about everyone on this call is in the same situation. Strangely, we've built our lives around the assumption that we could always travel around the world unimpeded. And clearly, I think for everyone, that's the biggest shock of the last 18 months nearly of COVID. But I've been lucky because I had a period of lockdown in Sydney in which I wrote my book, which was great to get that off my chest after 8 or more years thinking about it. But other than that, I had a fairly free life in China. In Australia, in Sydney, a very free life. And then I came back to China, and then suddenly you were all going through this terrible period in Australia. And I feel really, really sorry for everybody. I don't know how I would have coped with another extended period of lockdown, but that is how it is. And I really am reluctant to say, but in China, life is basically normal. I basically do what I like. People gather in groups. Restaurants are full and open. I've been traveling around China itself quite a bit. I mean, there are some concerns in China today about some COVID outbreaks in Yunnan and Nanjing, but certainly Beijing and everywhere else I've been in China, Jinan, Shanghai, Dunhuang, you really would hardly know that there was a pandemic in the world. Obviously, getting in and out of the country is challenging, but on a daily life, it really is largely unaffected. And I think that's a huge credit to Chinese government's ability to manage such a huge society and the discipline of Chinese people to follow the rules and do what they need to do in order to continue to live pretty much normal lives.
Thank you, Geoff. You make all of us envy with your situation.
I'm reluctant to say
Well, yeah.
I won't say that after this I'm going out to a Persian restaurant with a group of friends, and after that we're all off to a jazz club. I'm sorry to say that.
So back to your recent travel, one of the recent travels, Geoff, it sounds like you did a field one to Jinan as well. So obviously Dunhuang is one of the important, I guess, for Buddhism, for Chinese culture, is on the Silk Road, for Chinese history. Not only Chinese history, you know, the history in linked to other countries as well. And my understanding is that in 13 years, you traveled back to Dunhuang a few times. That was the most recent trip in June was your third trip to Dunhuang. What attracted you the most that make you go back to Dunhuang?
Yeah, changed so many things. The ancient history, the relics from the Han Dynasty. I'll talk about these things in more detail as I go through them. Being in the Gobi Desert, the remoteness, the history around the Dunhuang grottoes, obviously, the caves, the beautiful frescoes and sculptures that still remain despite everything over 1,000 years. So much is still left there. The history of the depredation by foreign invaders at the late 19th, early 20th century, the rediscovery of Buddhist oases, long covered by sand as a result of ecological change, and the theft of the ruins theft of the artifacts from those ancient Buddhist sites, the mystery of it all. And generally, I am passionate about Western China, Gansu, Xinjiang. I've traveled around these areas of China extensively, and it's all part of the great Central Asian story, which I think is fascinating and so understood and underappreciated in the Western world. But if you like, Yeching, let me go through a few elements of the headlines that I've just mentioned in a little bit more depth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'll be great. I think that there are some great photos as well.
Yeah, and you can flick them up. I'm sorry, it's a bit like when I was a kid. You know, your parents would go to the Gold Coast or something, and the whole family would have to sit around and watch the slides afterwards. But if it's not too much like that, and people don't get bored, by all means, please show the slides. But just let me start with the location of Dunhuang. For classical Chinese and for many centuries after that, Dunhuang, located in the Gobi Desert, was basically the edge of civilization. From there, when traders went forward, effectively it was like stepping off the civilized world into the great unknown world, and into the barbarian world. And it also was frontier of the Chinese Empire under the Han. And we have in the Gobi Desert some remarkable remains of their antiquity, would stand next to anything in classical Greece or Rome. And so, for example, from 120 BC, there is the Great Han Wall that stretches through the Gobi Desert. And this was the extent of the Western Han Empire. And for the Western Han, this was a dangerous area that had to be defended and protected. But I think there's a modern lesson in all of this. And I guess for me, history always speaks to me as issues that states and governments are dealing with today. And one of the biggest challenges throughout Chinese history has been the Western frontiers and controlling and managing the Western frontier. Now, when you go and visit, there's the remains of the Han Wall from 120 BC, as I mentioned. There are beacon towers, which was a complex system of defense and to alert garrisons strung along this ancient wall. You're reminded of how for 2,000 years or longer, China has had a highly centralized bureaucratic state to run this vast, far-flung empire. Significantly also in this area is the Yumen Pass, the Jade Gate, which had great significance for the traders of the day along the Silk Road. It's a ruin now, but then it was really the point at which civilization met the barbarian world. And when you pass through Yumenguan, you entered into this barbarian territory. Precisely at that point, the Silk Road bifurcates into its northern arm and its southern arm. And these arms wrap around the vast Taklamakan Desert in Xinjiang. And the southern arm basically took the Silk Road traders down through largely towards Pakistan, Afghanistan. Well, Pakistan, of course, was part of what we know as India now, but to the subcontinent, and the northern arm to Kashgar, and from Kashgar through Central Asia to the Mediterranean. And this was the most important global trading route in the world, and an active and dynamic trading route. And the traders who were passing in and out of Yumenguan became, over time, with the spread of Buddhism into Western China, Gangaren Buddhism, which had its home in Taxlia near Peshawar on the today's Pakistan-Afghanistan border, heavily influenced by Hellenic culture as a result of Alexander the Great's expeditions to the Indus River, as far as the Indus River. And so over time, these traders on the Silk Road started to paint and decorate what is now the grottoes of Dunhuang, and what Dunhuang is most famous for. And they would do good deeds by, as we see, the reclining Buddha, Nirvana. They would do good deeds by funding craftsmen to carve grottoes into the sides of steep valleys that are outside of Dunhuang, 12 kilometers in the case of the 1,000 Buddha Caves, which this one is from. And leave this photo up because I'll explain a little bit about it. And I must say, I didn't take this photo. This was in the Financial Review attributed to me, but you're not allowed to take photos inside the cave. So I don't know how they got it. It must have been from an official guide. But they were doing good works. And when they come back, I mean, they're doing good works to protect them on the dangerous journey into the barbarian worlds. And when they came back, they would do good works by decorating caves and buildings and putting up sculptures to the Buddha in thanksgiving for having survived the journey. And this is one of the biggest reclining Buddhas in China. I think it's the second. The biggest is outside of Chongqing. Mm-hmm. But I just wanted to draw attention to the frescoes at the back, because the color may seem a bit strange, but the color in the caves, where you see black and gray in these and dark browns, that's all a result of the oxidization of the paintings over time by the use of lead. But there are many caves where the colors, where there hasn't been a lot of lead used, are still brilliant in their turquoise and blues and so on. But this reclining Buddha is 1600 years old. And the serenity on Buddha's face is extraordinary. So this is what you see in the caves, and it's a remarkable artistic, historical collection of works. There's several different sites for the caves as well. As I said, this is from the most famous, the 1,000 Buddha Caves, or the Mogao Grottos. There's the Western Caves, and there's another grotto which I visited for the first time. As you said, Yeqing, I've been 3 times to Dunhuang. To go once is a privilege, and frankly, I'm extraordinarily lucky to have been 3 times, and it's one of those things I don't think you could ever go often enough in a lifetime. It is just such a remarkable place. But the grotto I went to for the first time is called Yulin Grotto, and it's 75 kilometers southwest of Dunhuang. It's at the western end of the Heshi corridor that runs through central Gansu. And the Heshi corridor is extremely important historically, because the Silk Road starts in Xi'an, but the Heshi corridor runs up into Dunhuang, and as I said, from Dunhuang, then the Silk Road bifurcates into the northern and southern arms. But it was a very strategic point because it's so narrow. It was a challenge to defend, and throughout this period, there were depredations from the Han, not the Han, the Han, Hun, wild tribes that the Han and other Chinese rulers were trying to defend against. There was, of course, the spread of Buddhism through the Heshi corridor, and eventually Islam came to this part of the world. The grottos have fantastic publicly accessible caves, but you can pay extra for what's called restricted or reserved caves. And there are many, really many, and it's a tiring day's visiting, particularly in the heat of early July. And Grace and I, my partner, were trying to work out which ones we go to, and we decided to only go to one. And it was one of the best calls we ever made, I think. Grace was particularly interested to see the Buddhist Mandalas in this cave, and that's really what it was promoted for. And there are some beautiful mandala on the roof and on 2 of the walls. But the most extraordinary thing is when you go inside, on the left and right-hand side inside the door, Western Shi dynasty, so that's like 11th century or thereabouts, frescoes that are painted in the classic traditional Chinese shan shui style. Very, very fine painting, over 1,000 years old, but depicting the life of the Buddha. So you have the complete, if you like, integration, symbiosis of traditional Han classical Chinese art with Buddhism. And the two are just there together in these most beautiful and beautifully preserved and protected works. I just found it completely stunning. And it brings home something to me, which is a little pet theory. I'm sure there's people on this call who are far, not sure I know, far more expert than me in any of this. But that I've long felt that you can't have a conversation really about Tibet and Buddhism and China as if they were separate entities. Historically, there's been an incredible symbiosis between the two. And you see it here in these Western Xia cave paintings, how deeply integrated Tibetan religion and culture was with traditional Chinese dynastic culture. And frankly, many people never go in Beijing to see the Eastern Qing tombs. But if you go to the Eastern Qing tombs, where all but 2 Qing emperors are buried, and remember the Qing are essentially Mongolian, the tombs are extraordinary because they're all covered in Tibetan religious Buddhist iconography. Just so, you know, there's 1,000 years where this is all existing, deeply connected and embedded in each other. Sorry, that's an aside, but it's something that I think about a lot, the relationship between Tibet and China, and I keep coming back to how deeply integrated for such a long period Tibetan religion was in Chinese traditional culture. As I said, for most people it's probably obvious, but for me it's something that I'm very interested in. So look, that's the art, that's the setting. I just want to say a couple of other things, Yeching, and throw it back to you to continue the discussion. Another aspect of this area that intrigues me and always has is the European explorers that came there in the late 19th, early 20th century. I'm a great fan of the Great Game, the competition between Britain and Russia around Central Asia, focused very much on Kashgar in Xinjiang as a sort of staging point for spies and adventurers and crazy people and crooks, the whole lot. But the amazing thing is that the British believed, quite erroneously, that Russia was going to somehow come through that area and take over, take India from the British. The Russians, of course, were very interested in Central Asia, but their ambitions didn't really cross the Himalaya into northern India. But for a period, 20 years, from 1890 through to the beginning of the First World War, essentially, foreign powers, mainly European, but also Japanese, were terribly interested in this part of the world for strategic and geopolitical reasons. And explorers found in Xinjiang principally, but also Dunhuang, and I'll finish on the Dunhuang point in a minute, they found buried cities in Xinjiang because essentially ecological change had changed the course of waters that had supported many towns and cities that were which were essentially Buddhist and covered by sand and forgotten about for 1,000 years. No one ever knew these places existed. And then Svev Hayden, in about 1892, a Swede, was the first to discover near Hutan in Xinjiang, the first one or two of these sites. And that encouraged Oriel Stein, a Hungarian, who was basically naturalized in Britain, to explore. And these guys were amazing, and were amazing courage. I mean, if anyone's been to the Taklamakan Desert, I've been there. The old explorers used to describe it as the sea of sand. There's just a rolling wave of massive sand dunes. The sand is as fine as talcum powder. Today, thanks to PetroChina, you can drive from north to south through the Taklamakan Desert in one day, 660 kilometers. And thanks to Israeli technology, the sand doesn't drift across the tarmac road. And I've done that trip. But these guys went through that in camel trains and walked it. And they discovered, must be 8, 10 buried oases. And some of these were absolutely jam-packed with Buddhist religious iconography, treasures, frescoes, many near Turfan, many near Hotan, Nia in the south, Churchen, all places I've actually been to and seen some of the remains or relics, but also in Dunhuang. And by the time Oriel Stein arrived in Dunhuang in 1905, no one had actually cared less about Dunhuang. It had gone from being a major garrison town and trading town and the point of departure on the Silk Road to a forgotten backwater in the Gobi Desert. But Stein came across the Dunhuang Caves. But whilst he was there excavating in the caves and busily snatching trophies, he heard about a secret cave, which is now known today as Cave 17. And eventually his Chinese guide found Abbot Wong, who was the guardian of Cave 17. And Abbot Wong was a bit of a crazy guy who had an obsession about building a new Taoist shrine or temple in Dunhuang, and was wanting to raise money. And for a pittance, Oriel Stein eventually got Abbot Wong to open what's now known as Cave 17. And in Cave 17, this is Cave 17, and the previous shot was Abbot Wong's stupa. In Cave 17, Stein found treasures of unbelievable significance. It had been closed for 1,000 years, and it was stuffed from floor to ceiling with Chinese manuscripts and Buddhist and Tibetan manuscripts, and works on silk and banners for religious occasions. Even the first printed book from the 6th century AD, all were in Cave 17. And tragically, over 2 visits, Stein cleaned out the entire content of Cave 17, which now is in the British Museum. But the British Museum, being very sensitive to the origin of all of this stuff, has very, very little on display and says very, very little about its holdings. But tragically, all these treasures, by and large, except for the caves that remain in Dunhuang, have been stripped bare and taken mainly to Europe and some to Tokyo. I've been to the caves near Turfan, which were discovered by Lecoq, who was a German explorer. And many of the frescoes he hacked off the walls and sent back to the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, which were then cemented onto the walls in Berlin, were bombed to pieces during the Second World War and are lost forever. So I think this is a big part of Chinese history, both in terms of the treasures that were there, but also the depredations that have occurred in modern times. That really needs to be talked about and understood by a much wider population. And finally, because Yeching, someone put up the slide, you would have seen a funny bright light with a modern mannequin of a policeman. This one here. This is something that didn't exist on my first or second visits to Dunhuang, but is now new. And this amazing light in the distance is called a sun tower. and it generates something like 370,000 megawatts of electricity each year and saves an enormous amount of carbon. And as this gigantic tower just pops up in the desert, in the Gobi Desert, consisting of mirrors that reflect the sun into some heating concept that drives generators, beyond which I can't explain it to you anymore, but you can Google it, as I've done, and find more about the sun tower. But this, like everything in China, everything changes. You see also the new train line in the back, and it's a high-speed train line. None of that was there last time I was in Dunhuang, which was, I think, 7 years ago or thereabouts. So, yeah, Ching, I'll stop at that point and throw it over to you and others.
Yeah, thanks, Geoff. That's really, really interesting to hear all the history and what's happened and what's happening now. Just to looking at your the last image you put on the sun tower. In Chinese poetry, there is a category dedicated to the West, to the desert. So one famous poem sentence called "春风不度玉门关." Spring wind doesn't go through Yumen Jade Gate.
Okay. Yes.
So it's a cold place and it's a desert, but with that sun tower there, it just reminds me of poetry. It's very interesting. And we already got a few questions, but I just quickly for my own interest and many people also interested, Geoff. So for Dunhuang, obviously experienced the long history, wartime, different events, and including cultural erosion. There was some damage as well. So what's the current status of the caves? You mentioned that you're not allowed to take photos inside. So it's a lot of, they are still well protected, and a lot of them and damage can be seen, or?
Look, there is some damage. It's damage done by the foreign explorers in the late 19th, or in the early 20th century. But I think the preservation is pretty good. UNESCO now works very, very closely with the Chinese, and they've done an enormous amount to preserve the caves. Numbers are quite restricted. Humidity is the biggest problem. That's having too many people in the caves. In my first two visits, 08 and 14, it was almost unrestricted. Now it's very tightly controlled, and everything, all the humidity is monitored and checked. And I think that's, working quite well. As I said, the use of lead has led to the discoloration, but that's just part of what it is. These days, you can't get near the cave areas. You have to stop at a car park a long way away and go in a bus to control crowd movements. At the Mogao Caves, there is two cinemas that you must sort of go to before you can then move into the caves proper. One of them's more a history of the area and the cave construction and all of that. But one of them is like a, like looking at the stars. It's a concave, massive concave ceiling, and you sort of lie in a half reclined area, and they project 360 degrees around this cinema, and it's the most fantastic introduction to the caves, and it's if you're walking in the caves yourself. And it's very, very, very high tech and very well done. So look, I think the level of preservation is very good, actually. And as I said, I mean, the Yulin Cave, cave number 3, which was one of the reserved ones. And I said, yeah, and you pay a little bit of extra money, and you've got an English guide to take you. Well, I needed an English guide, I have to say, but an English guide came through to take me through. It was in amazing condition. So all things considered, as you say, the long history, the depredations, all of that, it's pretty good. I mean, when you see Dunhuang, And then you go to some of the other caves, like the ones the Berkelex caves outside of Turfan in Xinjiang, which was just stripped bare by the Germans. It's just horrible to go to those caves and just see bare rock walls and try and imagine the extraordinary beauty of those caves and the decoration. It really, you know, you have to ask yourself about, you know, responsibility for these sorts of things. You can't not ignore the question, I think. But Dunhuang is intact, and gosh, you know, you can hear from me. I'd recommend it to anyone.
Yeah, that's great, Geoff. I think that, you know, as long as the international travel opened, we will jump to the first plan. Thanks, Geoff. I think we moved to Q&A part already. Quite a few questions here. Thanks a lot to give the, you know, really overview about Dunhuang and also very in-depth knowledge about what's happening currently. So the first question is from a friend Yin Cao. Geoff, you know her as well. Yin is a curator, Chinese art curator of New South Wales Gallery, is our friend. Here Yin said, "Hi Geoff, how envy I am, blah blah blah." So so what Yin said is, because Yin was a curator of New South Wales Gallery, the quite a big exhibition on Tang Dynasty. It's called, many of our participants maybe been to that excellent exhibition, Tang Treasures from the Silk Capital. So what Yin was asking is, so currently related to what we've been talking just now, what's the proportion of caves are still open to public, and what's the proportion actually closed, you know, for now? So still a lot of them are open.
Yeah, thanks, Yin, and thanks very much for joining the chat, and great to hear from you. Yeah, it seems to me a lot are still open. My first visits, particularly 2008, it was pretty much a free-for-all. 2014, you really had to have a guide to go around, but that was fine. But we saw as much as we wanted to see. There are two levels, as I said with the Yulin Caves. On our guided trip, the publicly open ones, we went to about 8, I think. And they vary the 8 you go to each day, or certainly according to humidity levels in the caves. So they're very conscious that people's perspiration and breath and so on can damage the frescoes. But then, as I said, for a smaller fee, and that's at all the caves, Mogao, Yulin, whatever, you can go and see another maybe 4 or 5 caves in a day. But I think the point is they're pretty much all available, but by and large, mainly on rotation. Mm-hmm. Now, some aren't rotated, but they're the very big ones. So on the entrance to the Mogao Caves, you may be familiar with that big facade. That inside that is a gigantic standing Buddha, gigantic. But that's a huge space. And for example, in that cave, there seems to be no restriction on access. But the reclining Buddha that you showed the photo of, that in fact was closed, I think, on the day we went. Yeah. Mm. But yeah, it's really they're all rotated. And frankly, I don't know, you probably have a lot more energy than me. Like any of these things, you can only see so many in one day, and then it's enough.
Mm. Okay, thanks a lot, Geoff. And that's good to know a lot of them are open to public. The next question is from a Phoenix Television Media. This is a related, not exactly Dunhuang, but in more general question. During the difficult time of Australian-China relationship, do you think there is any space for cultural communication between two countries? Can you give us any example?
I think there's only space for cultural communication. I mean, the relationship is in such a dire situation. There is obviously some business going on, a lot of business if you're in iron ore, but I think now more than ever, culture communication is extremely important, and the work that our institutions do and our individuals do is a big part of it. I mean, many people on this call will know of Brian Wallace and Redgate Gallery. Well, Brian's starting a month celebration of his 30 years operating. And you know, things like that, I think are extremely important to remind people in China as well as in Australia that the first contemporary gallery in all of China, contemporary art gallery in all of China, was opened by an Australian. And we're having a month of celebration supporting Brian in that. And I think these things are extremely important. So when bilateral political relationships are going through such an extraordinarily difficult period, you really have to put a lot of focus and attention on the cultural relations.
Thanks, Geoff. The next question is from Paul Mellon. Thank you, Geoff, for a very interesting presentation. I have 3 questions. Can we just ask one and give some questions to others? But that's okay. You mentioned a 6th century printed book, the first printed book. By what technology was it produced? Question 2, what caused the decline of this impressive society? Was it ecological, invasion, or combination of the factors? Third one, what was the language of this society? Does it bear any resemblance to any contemporary language spoken in China?
Yeah, look, good questions, all of them. Thanks very much, Paul. First one, short answer is I don't know, but I'm sure you can find out fairly quickly. You can look it up. The second one is fascinating. Why did it decline? And it's a good question because it was a very vibrant civilization. First of all, for the other oasis towns on the Silk Road and around the Taklamakan Desert, mainly in Xinjiang, it was largely ecological. That they were all dependent on very complex irrigation style systems for taking water off the surrounding mountains and feeding it into the towns. And for various reasons, weather patterns changed, runoff changed, and these towns over time were abandoned. I've been, for example, to Nia, which is fascinating. It's in the southern arm of the Silk Road, south of the Taklamakan Desert, just near the Kunlun mountain range. And today it's just a sandy desert with sticks sticking out of the ground where buildings used to be. It was once a very vibrant town, but the runoff water changed through silting and through climatic change. And the town was abandoned. So that's true for most of them. Dunhuang's a little different. It's a bit more geopolitics. The Ming extended the Great Wall of China to Jiayuguan, which is now the furthest western end of the Great Wall of China, and it's still there, and the fortifications are still there. So Dunhuang's importance as a garrison town was eclipsed by the Ming extending the Great Wall to Jiayuguan. And you know, of course, the Silk Road declined as a result of the opening of seaborne trade between Europe and Asia after Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope. And then there was the Islamic occupation of Western China. And again, that changed the importance of the place. So all these things together meant that Dunhuang, which is to our great advantage today because it's so intact and so well preserved, became a forgotten, neglected backwater. And the third question I forget, but I'm sure I can't answer it. So maybe we can move on.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for that. The next question, I believe, is from Beijing, our friend Rose Wong. I have visited Mogao Caves this 2 weeks ago. Oh, Rose, lucky you. And I realized the fact that the mural paintings was mural paintings was not just a religious paintings, but have incorporated the people's everyday life and the imagination into the religious story. I know that you are contemporary art collectors, and you are such a fans of history as well. So do you think these paintings were considered as contemporary art of times? I would like to know more your perspectives on the collection between history and contemporary art. That's an interesting question from our artist in Beijing, Rose Wang.
Hi, Rose. Lovely to hear from you. I saw your moments. You had a good trip to Gansu, and good luck with your upcoming show at the Vermilion. That's wonderful. Look, it's a great question, but really, so much art historically did depict everyday life. You know, if you go to I forget now the huge cathedral in the center of Florence. I'm sorry, it just escapes me now. But you know, it's fabulous marble cathedral, green and marble and blue and things. But if you look at the stained glass windows largely depict the everyday life of wool, WOOL, wool merchants, because the wool merchants largely funded the building of that cathedral. And this is the same with the Dunhuang Caves. The merchants who are leaving China, leaving the known world, then going to the barbarian worlds, coming back safe, they were funding the painting of these caves and the offerings and the doing good deeds. But of course, it's normal life. It depicts the life of the times. And I think it's an interesting question. I mean, you can probably write a very interesting thesis about, in all different cultures, everyday mercantile life will be reflected in religious paintings and works, simply because they're the people who paid for it, and that's the life they lived. I mean, using my great freedom that I enjoy in China at present, this weekend I'm going to Taiwan, Ching's home, principally because I want to go back and visit the sarcophagus at the Taiwan Museum, which Tao Ying, who's on the call, brought to the New South Wales Galleries a couple of years ago. I first saw it on a visit to Taiwan a decade or so ago. I just want to go and see it again, but it's from the 9th century, I think, Tao Ying, and it predicts everyday life of a Persian trader. And it's in green and white and red marble. It's Persian, and it's in Taiwan. And this guy was a Persian who lived in Taiwan. Of course, Taiwan's part of the Silk Road, and that's the great, if you like, for me, fascination and excitement I get from traveling on, visiting, talking about, writing about the Silk Road. It's this amazing corridor of cultural exchange, and terribly modern, Rose, in that sense.
Yeah, thanks, Geoff. That's very exciting. Yeah, I actually very luckily saw the Yin's curated exhibition in New South Wales Gallery. You were not in Sydney back then, but again, you know how much I wish I could fly back to hometown. Good luck with that. Here I have a question from Mary Hart from Sydney. I think, Geoff, you touched on what her question, but you may like to say a little bit more if you like. Geoff, did you see the changes over time? You visited Dunhuang 3 times. And do you think the change is a positive or negative one?
It's interesting. Obviously, everywhere in China is changing simply because of the economic growth and economic development. But I didn't feel such a big change even from my first visit in 2008. So we're talking 13 years. The town's a small town. For China, it's tiny. These days, it's only around 200,000 people. It's nothing. It still has, in the evenings, a wonderful outdoor market. You still sit around and eat lamb kebabs, yang rou chua, roast lamb legs and lamb cutlets, drink beer in the evening. It's a very it's Islamic. Most people are Muslim, but there's not an obvious sort of Islamic presence. But the lifestyle is very much like you find in Xinjiang. It's on the edge of the desert. There's a lot more new buildings since I was last there. Funny, I've stayed at the same hotel 3 times over 13 years. It's called the Silk Road Hotel. It was a bit sort of flash 13 years ago. It's less so now, but it's ideally located next to sand dunes and great at 5 o'clock in the evening to sit as the sun starts to set and have some cocktails watching the sand dunes. It's just an amazing, relaxed, laid-back place. And yes, it is more developed than it was 13 years ago. And there are more hotels and so on. But of course, now with COVID, there are no foreign tourists. Whereas 13 years ago and 7 years ago, every day there would be buses disgorging big numbers of foreign tourists, particularly from Japan and Korea and Thailand and Taiwan, because these people all want to go and see the sort of artifacts of early Buddhist culture. In fact, I remember when I was working in the embassy in the 80s, I think it was 88, was the first visit since China, since Communist China was established in 49 by a Japanese Prime Minister. And it was a highly sensitive thing, but the Japanese Prime Minister went to Dunhuang. Mm. And for the Japanese, it was a big deal because it acknowledged the Buddhist origins in China of Japanese culture. Mm. And so then it was a really, really big deal that he made that visit. So Dunhuang is full of all of these sort of historical nuances and resonance and complexity for many, many people, and very, very important for the Buddhist world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's I guess it's such a fascinating place. You mentioned Joseph Needham's trip in 1940s in Dunhuang. I remember I read Joseph Needham's plan was visiting Dunhuang for 1 day, and then he stayed there for months and couldn't leave. So it's the charm of it. Here we got a very nice recommendation from Yin. Yin mentioned, thank you, Geoff, for talking about the plundering of the treasures at Dunhuang. If anyone is interested, I could recommend it to listen to a Spotify piece, a fascinating conversation between Getty's director, James Kuno, and the author of the book, The Compensation of the Plunder, How China Lost Its Treasures. So anyone interested, thank you, Yin, for that recommendation. So I think the time is,
I would love to see the book or whatever. So please send me
I'll send you the name. Yeah.
And on the plundering of treasures, I guess everyone knows this book by Peter Hopkirk, Foreign Devils on the Old Silk Road. You can see my copy is very well worn. It's been with me on every trip to Dunhuang. And Hopkirk wrote the fantastic book, The Great Deck Game, about the geopolitical contest for Central Asia between Britain and Russia. But Yin might be interested as well. At the end of the book, he basically says that, well, not basically, he says that what happened to Count Otani, the Japanese explorer's collection, no one knows. And in 2008, I went to Port Arthur near Dalian, called New Shun Ko. And New Shun Ko was closed until those years because it was the Chinese submarine base. Then they moved the submarines to Hainan Island and they slowly started to open it. It wasn't quite open when I went there, but I got there because I got hammered on Baijiu with the Liaoning party secretary, who said to me after dinner in Shenyang, is there anything I could do for you? And I said, yes, I want to go to Port Arthur. and 2 days later I was at Port Arthur. But the quick story is, I see we're running out of time, is that in Port Arthur Museum is Count Otani's collection from the Silk Road, the most incredible Buddhist statues, and people don't really know about it. And now it's all open, you can go there. It is just amazing to see it. But that's where the Japanese collection ended up.
Yeah, amazing. I think we're almost to 7 o'clock here. One last question, Geoff. You mentioned you stayed in the same hotel, Silk Road hotels, in your 3 trips. Here is a question for you. Hi, Geoff, from Lanshen from Shanghai, our friend. Hi, Geoff. Any Aussie wines served in Dunhuang Silk Road Hotel?
Lansha, I don't know, but I have lovely gin and tonics on the roof. Well, wow. There's no empty wine. It's all Gansu wine. Well, just don't have high expectations, is all I'd say.
Well, thanks a lot, Geoff. That's wonderful to have you to share these stories of Dunhuang with us in this, particularly in this lockdown time. Give us some, pictures, beautiful pictures far away from Dunhuang. And thanks to everyone joined the Zoom talks, and stay well. If you are in Australia, Sydney or Melbourne or Adelaide, enjoy your life if you're in Shanghai and Beijing. Thank you.